Well, we felt like we were nearly drowning, and it's the feeling that's important.
Okay, thanks. Thank you all for this. And I've learned a lot. I'm a historian of the Caribbean, so needless to say, my brain is stuffed full of all kinds of new knowledge and new ideas. So it's been really interesting. I guess I have three kind of questions for people, and they're broad and they're a little bit generalizing. So if you object, if you have sort of objections to things about that I say that you did or didn't do, please go ahead. So okay, so the first one is about I guess methodologies and frames, and it's a little bit following up on what Pilar had to say. And one of the things that I kept thinking about all day was why the national analysis, right? Why are we sticking to the national? And this isn't a kind of criticism. I would love to hear the political scientists and I guess it's mostly political scientists, few literature people, but sort of think about that. Do we need to think about other frames, things like urban-rural, the transnational, other ways to divide up states, literate, non-literate, armed, non-armed, all of those kinds of things. And then I guess more broadly, I was thinking about other kinds of terms, older methodological terms, the linguistic term, subaltern studies, gender, microhistory, and then kind of newer terms, transnational, post-humanist, narrative, affective, all of those kinds of terms. Are those methods or tools useful in these questions, or are they at odds with the project that people seem to be engaging in and that we're engaging in here? And that's really more of a kind of informational question. I don't know what the disciplines, what their relationship is to things like the post-humanist trend. Second is something that John brought up a little bit. Do we need to study the right? And how do we study the right? Alejandra said something about inability to imagine each other. And that means we have to think about both sides and how they're imagining one another. It's about polarizations. And something that I do think a little bit about is the media and what's the role of the media. People sort of related to the kind of national media in the way that it's been captured by the right. But also I think that it might be really interesting not just to look at traditional media outlets like newspapers and television, but social media. There's a huge literature on the role of social media and things like the Arab Spring and that, and I don't see that much of it in these kinds of discussions, that I would just be really curious to think about how does social media, how does media consumption as well as production affect the kinds of things that we're looking at. And third is the question of language that's come up a couple of times more strongly, I guess, in the last panel. This idea of, was it a coup? Wasn't it a coup? Who gets to say? Who gets to decide that it was a coup and or that it wasn't? It's really interesting to think about the implications of language and categories and the way that they shape how we think and talk about things. And I guess related to that, I would love to hear people's reflections on what is the role, especially in terms of language and how we talk about and write about things, what is the role of the academy and of scholarship in politics? Is there a sense in which, what's the responsibility of the academy to the processes that we're tracking? Are we just observing? Are we going to participate in them? What is the role of the academy in this movement? And I think that's really salient in all kinds of contexts, including the Canadian and the US as well as Latin America. And I guess my inclination is not to suggest that we come up with new categories. Okay, do we talk about tides or turns? But actually that we listen more carefully to the ways different political actors are talking about what their experience is. What are the categories with which people are talking about the kinds of things that they're experiencing right now? What are their categories and what are their sort of modes of analysis? And just an observation, there weren't very many human beings in these papers, apart from Alejandra had an informant, we had Roberto, And then there were all of the presidents who were listed, various times. But apart from that, I didn't really, unless I missed it, and it was a long day. But there weren't that many people that we were talking about. So I would just be really curious in terms again of sort of method and tools. Why those choices? Why those choices to sort of not focus on people and to focus on other kinds of things like institutions. I think that's it. Thank you.
Chris.
Okay, great. So thanks so much for all the papers, all the talks and questions and thoughtful responses. And I thought that I might try to end today maybe where we began, with some of the comments that Max offered, mostly just in a desperate attempt to cling to maybe just one or a couple questions in this sea of, to extend the metaphor, of lots and lots of different questions. And I guess in response to kind of some of the recent political events south of the border and my home country of the United States, I've been trying to latch on to Albert Hirschman's sort of, the bias for hope, to this enjoinder to embrace a passion for the possible, and mostly it's just a self-help measure. It provides an interesting political perspective as well. And so I think through that lens, I want to offer some thoughts and some questions about one of the questions I think that was raised by Max at the outset was, and that the organizers indeed asked everyone, was what the legacy is of the past decade or 15 years or so of left governments in Latin America. And the papers in various ways definitely speak to that question. And I think the way I break it down and try to think about it in the country that I know the best, that I study the most seriously is in Brazil. And I think even if we look at Brazil, I think even as dark as things are in these current times, I think there actually are, in historical perspective and comparative perspective, some points, some in favor of a bias towards hope. So if we sort of take Max's launching off point, how should we view these left turns? I mean, did they, sort of, a la the Colliers, represent a new form of incorporation, or do they represent something sort of more fundamental and transformational going on in the way of the introduction of new participatory institutions and democratic spaces that open up a space for broader and more inclusive forms of citizenship to form? And I think some of the papers really speak to that, even though they didn't highlight that actually as much. I mean, there's been a lot of reference to participatory institutions, participatory budgeting. There's been a lot of references to indigenous peoples movements, women's movements in Latin America, all of which have, I think, used democratic institutions forged through the left turns to gain greater hold on power. So I think that's one non-trivial, point of light to hold on to. But I think if we don't look at them as this critical juncture that others would say we should look at them as, and see them as the sequence of reactions and counter-reactions and the progression of political liberalism, I think it's pretty clear that some of the institutions that the left turns have introduced actually really are fundamentally redistributive and have the potential, anyways, to introduce new and more inclusive forms of governance and citizenship. So, I think it's, the scandals in Brazil have come up constantly today, and so I can't help or resist sort of adding a few 2 cents about that. I mean, I think one of the biggest points about the Ministerio Público too is just the fact that it exists and that it is actually run in some cases by competent bureaucrats who are actually sort of trying to fulfill the mission of upholding democratic accountability. So I mean, I think if you just look at Brazilian society now, the fact that the Ministerio Público is out there and that it exists and that it has prosecutors who are actually investigating corrupt politicians, in taking them to trial, in some cases trying to punish them for crimes, and it's non-trivial, or at least it's something that I think before the left turns would not have existed. I think it's not too much of a stretch to say. We know from, and the very fact, what we learned, I think, from some of those investigations too, was just how threatened the political elite was by the Ministerio Público. I mean, we know from the recordings of Hammer just how deeply fearful they were of the Ministerio Público actually prosecuting what they had been doing and potentially, jailing them. So I just think that the fact, in historical perspective, if you rewind the tape back to 15 years ago, before the left turn sweep into power, that's just something that I think would have been unimaginable. Even just some short, 15 years ago. I mean, some people, maybe they're going a little too far to say that this is the fourth branch of government in Brazil, with its powers to investigate political elites. But, I just think that that's something that's non-trivial that shouldn't be completely lost. Now, at the same time, I totally understand the points being made that there is a real danger that these institutions fall into the hands of, well, sometimes it's just purely into the hands of technocrats, or that they fall into the hands of ideologues on the right who are seeking to reverse a lot of the progress that was institutionalized by the left turns and actors on the left, even just in Brazil. And so we shouldn't, I don't think, romanticize at all, what these kinds of new spaces and democratic institutions can do, because there is that danger, and we've seen it abused, right? I mean, just after the Chapecoense scandal, Renato was talking about how, the legislators in Brazil, they called a kind of marathon session that lasted into the wee hours in the morning while the country was supposedly mourning, right? The loss of this incredible opportunity to put through a whole series of, provisions that will make it, that would crack down on the Ministerio Público investigators, as well as the judges. I mean, there was a lot in that legislation, I guess, that got put through in a very sort of, I think, insidious and mean-spirited sort of way. So there's no question that these institutions can also be reversed and sort of have some of their powers sort of stripped away from them and emasculated and turned to different purposes. So I don't want to romanticize them either, but I also just think that if we look at what they did, they really were turning the tide of sort of general sort of dominance of neoliberal ideas at the time, which I think are fundamentally destructive of democracy and democratic institutions. I think they stand more than anything for the preservation of capital and relations of production and exchange, but beyond that, there's not really democratic institutions that a neoliberal project seeks to codify and to protect. So I think the fact that these institutions now, even though they're facing severe challenges and usurpation by political interests very much on the opposite end of the spectrum as those that in some ways helped create them in the first place. We trace back the origins of the Ministerio Público to the Citizen Constitution of 88. It's clear that these have sort of some pretty important origins in the movements that led to the left turn in Brazil, and then beyond too. So just by way of conclusion, I think one of the take-home points is that you need to look no further than Brazil, even in a moment of pretty, I think, historic political crisis, right? You've got to go back to Collor or maybe before it to find a darker moment in Brazilian politics. But the fact that these organizations are out there, even calling out, some of the clientelist ties between political and economic elites in Brazilian society, and in some places actually holding them accountable. I mean, that is the most fundamental function of democratic institutions, is to hold people accountable, hold leaders accountable to law. So I think that's not nothing. I think that's something that actually is a pretty important legacy. We'll see how the Ministerio Público survives in the next few weeks and months as legislators try to strip away its powers, but the fact that it's still standing at this moment, I think, and that institutions like participatory budgeting on subnational level are still standing is non-trivial. Secondly, and finally, I think that these spaces, these institutions, and really the practice of democracy, is not about the institutions. It's about the people who participate in them. It's about the bureaucrats, the politicians, but also the citizens and the accessibility of these spaces to citizens And I think that's something that came through. We didn't see a lot of voices of actual humans, as Alejandra, I think, very nicely pointed out. I do research on health movements in Brazil, and you can look across the biggest cities in Brazil over the last 25 years and find that really the best health outcomes holding constant a whole bunch of usual suspects, like political ideology of ruling parties in the mayor's office or governor's office, holding constant all the usual suspects. You can see a very strong positive effect of the occupation of health activists in their roles in the institutions of the SUS, the Sistema Único de Saúde, the public health system, which has a responsibility, a constitutional responsibility to enact the right to health in Brazil. And I think one of the lessons that I've taken away from that is that, you know, institutions like the SUS, institutions of participatory budgeting, institutions of the Ministério Público, they're not nothing. I mean, in terms of their potential to foster democratic accountability, but I think the sequel to that is that they may only run very effectively for democratic purposes, or at least the democratic purpose of holding elites accountable to laws and to rights, like the right to health in Brazil, for example. They only really function to the extent that, well, maybe it's social movement veterans, maybe it's just citizens who have a sense of the rights that are enshrined in those institutions, actually work within those institutions to try to enact policy, tangible policy reforms that can put these sorts of changes into practice. So that's not to say that there's not an important role for popular mobilization, because there absolutely is, and I think we actually saw that in the streets of major Brazilian cities even yesterday. And the revival of the student movement at the moment in Brazil, I think, is a pretty amazing and exciting story to keep tabs on as well, because that's a sector in which I think it's fair to say that there's been a dearth of education activists in the institutions in the public education institutions across Brazil, and the outcomes have been much more middling than what we've seen in the health sector over the last 15 years. But I think you see also a resurgence of popular support and student mobilizing to try to correct for that. So I think I'll stop there, but it's more a set of questions and an attempt to tie together some of the ideas throughout the day.
So.
Well, first off, I very much like to thank John and Max and the absent Alec for having me here today, because I found today extraordinarily stimulating. I'm very grateful for the chance of having been here. But I've also found the day utterly bewildering. And I'm one of those people who always thinks just a few seconds too late of the right riposte to a comment, or possibly even thinks of the right answer, in the wee small hours of the next morning. So can I come back about 8 o'clock tomorrow morning? I'll tell you, I have something brilliant to say then. I guess bewildering partly because this category of the left has been so elusive to me through the day. With all those graphs that you dislike so much, John, showed up so much variation in different ways between left regimes, and then Leslie's so little difference between left regimes and non-left regimes. And so, I mean, this is not a wholly unoriginal remark, but, it really has come home to me again during the day that the categories of left and right with which we have operated for so long are so problematic these days. I won't go on, but I think that we probably do need to stand back a bit from those sort of historic ways of thinking about politics, to focus more on several other kinds of divisions which have, I think, been shown up in recent politics. I guess that the main thing I want to say, which in some ways echoes Alejandra's concern about, where are the people, maybe reflects the fact that, I don't know your countries. And but for me, the question of where are the people has been present through the day, because through the day I've really been wondering about the social basis of different regimes, of different political movements, and I think to make sense of some of what has been discussed and to get a real handle on continuity and change in the present, I think I need to understand a lot more about the social bases of different political movements. What, for example, are the relationships of different fractions of the working classes in different contexts? Eric, you referred in passing to that question. What are the relationships of fractions of working classes with fractions of middle classes? And what are relationships with rural people, with rural classes in this? So I'm wondering too, you guys all know this, I don't, or don't know very much, but I have questions about what have been the impact of neoliberal policies and of recent patterns of growth, precisely on these sort of relationships between different social groups. And in the context that I'm familiar with in India, one of the most important consequences of the pattern of growth of the last sort of 20 years is the exclusion of labor. And I'm wondering how far labor is excluded in Latin America. Then in the Indian case, I think that part of the explanation for the raft of social legislation, of social rights legislation which has been passed, programs which have been implemented, like I'm sure we'll all have heard of the National Rural Employment Guarantee, the most, the biggest public works program that there's ever been. I think a lot of this has delivered real benefits to lots of poor people, but it's also hard not to see these policies as being about the management of the mass of poor people. The idea of les classes dangereuses of 19th century France. I mean, there may not be too much sign of the poor people of India being a dangerous class, but I think there is a sense in which a lot of the social policy sort of legislation programs of the recent past are about the management of the masses. And I'm sort of wondering a little bit about the extent to which some of what's been going on in Latin America over the last 15 years or so is also about the management of the masses. Leslie, in a comment you made, I think in the last session, you spoke of normal, boring social democratic politics. I wasn't quite sure in what context, but I thought, if only, because Eric had just told me in the session before that there ain't much sign of normal, boring social democratic politics. And I'm sort of wondering where there are the bases in Latin America for sort of systematic, sort of progressive politics. I mean, I guess that in Latin America, as elsewhere, the organized working class is much less than it perhaps was the vehicle for such politics. Where now is there the base for progressive politics? I had questions about participatory politics as well, raised by Max in the first presentation, but you didn't say very much about participatory politics, and I really would like to know more about them, but and also more about the institutions that you were talking about. Where I think we're talking about state capacity, but these are detailed questions that we can't expect to, or I can't expect you to pick up in this discussion. So I think I'd like to just make two other comments or points, or I think the second one is a kind of a question to you guys. So perhaps I'll start with that. It's just that some of you have been talking about things that are happening today or just last night in Brazil. Well, you know, late last night, the chief minister of my state in India, the state of Tamil Nadu, a lady called Jayalalitha, died. And this is a you know, really major event because she was in many ways a sort of titanic figure. She was emphatically a populist, but operating in the context of competitive populism, where two political parties, which owe their origins to a sort of broad lower class movement started about 100 years ago. These two parties have been competing around, you know, populist agendas over the last 50 years. And actually they've delivered. And they've delivered remarkably well in terms of, okay, international terms, standards of human development, social development in Tamil Nadu may not be great, but in the context of India, they're pretty high. About as good as Kerala, which probably everybody here knows from the work of Amartya Sen is a remarkable sort of case. And yet at the same time, Tamil Nadu has been economically pretty successful. Anyway, I could go on and I mustn't, but my question is, so what happened to populism in Latin America? It hasn't sort of been mentioned too much in the course of the day, and I'm just curious as to, you know, where the populist currents are now and sort of where they're at. Okay, so the last point was to do with the crisis of representation, and with Alex's question this morning, which hit me quite forcibly. I think I quote him exactly. How does despair resolve itself into an alternative? And I think, you know, how despair has resolved itself into an alternative in many parts of the world in the present is in finding a strong man. And, you know, somebody, I think it was, is it Juan, talked about fathers, did you, in the Latin American, father figures in the Latin American context. But I think the figures you were talking about are ones who've, you know, recently kind of disappeared from the stage. So I'm just sort of wondering about what seems to me to be sort of the absence of strong men in the Latin American present. Where is your Modi, you guys? To those who know Indian politics at all, because, you know, the rise of Modi, who is emphatically a sort of political strongman, quite apart from his boasts of having a 56-inch chest, is in significant part in the context of what has been described, and I really like it in the course of the discussion today, of the sort of hysterical sort of crusade against corruption, which is always a crusade against political corruption, as if, you know, businessmen, for example, are never corrupt. But India has had its own very powerful anti-corruption movement that was fundamentally, yes, anti-democratic. And that's part of the context of the rise of the Indian strongman. Anyway, talk for far too long.
Okay, thank you so much. We have quite a long time for discussion. The three marvelous presentations, you did a fantastic job. Almost did an impossible job fantastically to kick off the discussion. So it's less that there's to and fro between whatever the public and them and they. But they please should continue to contribute. I will try to organize things for us. So who would like to Yes.
I'm just going to pick up a few threads that I was thinking about in the context of the day, and speaks to the point that Alejandra just made, which has to do with whether the right, especially they're talking about whether it's in context of terms or epochs or whatnot, a moment that does seem to be somehow both different from what we've seen and also similar to what we've seen historically. And I think that grappling with that question is significant politically in terms of that tactics and strategy, but also in terms of analysis, because it confronts us with really powerful questions as to what we are willing to ask, which is to say the following. In your presentation, Eric, I didn't have a chance to ask you this before, but it seemed like there was a little bit of a tension in what you were describing. On the one hand, you ended with a really pessimistic assessment of whether it's possible in Latin America to negotiate with elites, especially in some contexts where there would be far more information than others, and whether that can be done at a level that's programmatic, or whether that has to be done at a level that's strategic. And yet, at the same time, we also seem to make the case that social democracy should be the baseline aspiration for progressive social movements against the community. So I'm not sure how to reconcile that. Right? If on the one hand we admit and accept that call it the right, call it the elites, are constitutional, ill disposed, right, to see, then where does that lead us in terms of questions like rights? And here comes the issue of the media. What will we do in the face of media evaluation? Where does this question of freedom of the press come in? Are we willing, in that context, to say, actually there should be some curtailment? There should be some sort of law, mechanism by which we build up these media economics and deal with the backlash, right, which will come. Right? So this is a fundamental sort of question about what we are willing to do faced with this tremendous tension because what is possible in the future. Which speaks to another issue that I've been really wrestling with all day, and I so much appreciated your presentation, because it really brought home the idea of, in the context of the right no longer having the military as a viable option, whether it's because we seem to be optically unable to resort to them, or whether it's because the military is discredited. And the way in which they have now turned to other mechanisms to countermand social change. One of the tools that we didn't discuss, at least I thought that I didn't hear it, was the way in which over the last 17 years, certainly because of Minnesota and extended elsewhere, but we too. The other thing that's been democratized is protests, street protests. Before, the right to just turn to the military and to existing institutions to state its claims. What it had to do over the last 17 years was also resort to the streets. We certainly saw this in the case of Minnesota, Goodwill, etc. So the streets have become sites of significant focus, whereas before the streets are really a location, I think, primarily of progressive and other social movements that state their claims precisely because the states are the energy. So what does that mean for us going forward? Is politics, especially in this context where the street has now become such a powerful terrain, both of the right and the left, is that basically where we're going? Which of course would not be would not be unheard of in Latin American history. That's exactly what happened in Argentina in the 1940s. Right? And so is this the kind of return that we're seeing? Like not sort of a return to a way that sort of manifests itself in ways that are very, very different, but rather a place where, you know, a right that understands that the multi-struggle of those institutions in the streets.
Just a brief comment on this talk. I agree with you that it's something positive to have institutions like the Ministério Público working the way they are against corruption in Brazil. Although I'm a little bit worried when they start to criminalize politics. And why am I worried about it? Because although you can say that the left turn in Brazil was responsible for the emergency of such institutions, I could say that the stabilization of political regime in Brazil was even more important for the emergency of such institutions and for the importance they acquired in our system. And in criminalizing politics, they are undermining the same stabilization that allow for their existence. So the ascension of such institutions, such control institutions, is a direct consequence of the institutionalization, for example, of the party system in Brazil. And the fact that we could change governments without recurring to violence and without recurring to a coup as we did before was directly responsible for the emergence of such institutions. And when they start to compare politics with mafia or organized crime, we are actually opening the gate for the ascension of non-politicians or people that argue they are not politicians that could undermine these same institutions that are contributing for their ascension. So that's why I'm worried about when these institutions are not balanced with other powers, for instance.
Yes, I've forgotten your name, and then Leslie.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry. Yeah, going on what Alejandra was saying about the right to not be able to use the military as a tool anymore, and what you were saying about the I can't remember the colors used, but I see and I know I'm talking like 5 or 3 minutes about Central America. Bring it in, I guess everybody's desire. But the case of El Salvador is interesting beyond the fight from there because you have a leftist government that has used the military in full force beyond anything that the right ever did in 20 years of power against gangs or communist criminals. And it's evolved into a situation where if you poll people in the streets, people are actually calling for the return of the death squads of the Civil War because the government's been able to secure citizens' well-being beyond just providing basic services, but the actual physical well-being of some of the highest content rate in the world. And I very much fear the fact that the military is now being used as luckily in El Salvador, but you have it in public security as well and Brazil as a tool of the left now. And what that means in terms of democratic quality for people who are being given power. And I'm not sure about the case in Brazil and Israel, but the executive very much has involved in the exclusively no accountability of the legislature. So coming on to the point of the rates of crime that have been partly the legacy of neoliberal policies and equality and poverty, and on your policies first getting the rate, I find it increasingly worrisome that we will not pass appropriate the military. And now that it's coming to an end of power, I wonder how is the right going to climb one up in terms of citizen security and involving the military.
Actually, I'm just wondering. I've got Leslie next, but I wonder if either Chris wants to respond to Renato or Eric to Katya, so we're also sort of maintaining a conversation.
Yes, sir. So,
And then Leslie, sorry.
yeah, I completely appreciate the point, and I think it speaks to maybe the second half of what I was trying to argue, that I think a lot of these new democratic institutions in Brazil and also I think in other countries as well, you know, it depends a lot on sort of who's occupying them. You know, in the case of the health movement in Brazil, I think what you see, one of the reasons why you see such really impressive health outcomes over the last 25 years is that, you know, especially in city level, you know, the people who ended up holding the high, you know, cargos de confiança, you know, the positions that were institutionalized in the SUS, like the SUS management position, were movement veterans. It's like, I hear what you're saying, because I think that there's a big danger for these spaces, the Ministério Público included, to become another political football. I mean, and so that when they're occupied by, you know, in some of the cases you're talking about, I mean, I'm not sure which cases exactly you're talking about, but I think it varies state by state, and the Ministério Público has different offices in every state, and the ones that I know the best are the ones where the Ministério Público has actually been leveraged by Movimento Sanitário to you know, bring claims on municipal governments that haven't been actually paying the doctors to show up in the health clinics, and haven't been paying the, you know, the bills to put X-ray machines in the clinics. And the cases that I know are where the Ministério Público has been sort of wielded for, you know, certainly for purposes of particular set of actors, have been the ones where, you know, I think it's often been health activists who decided to try to wield that institutional space for the interests of the health movement, some of the notion of the right to health that was so important for so many years. So I completely agree with you that simultaneously runs the risk of these spaces being controlled and occupied by, you know, actors that are simply trying to criminalize all forms of politics. I mean, so I think that's just an ineradicable dilemma, though, about democracy in general. You know, it depends a lot on who's sort of the power of the actors, the social movements who try to wield the democratic institutions for particular purposes. And I think that's one reason why I'm more sort of heartened by the more recent popular mobilization, both of the Movimento Sanitário. There's a newer generation of the health activists who are starting to realize that the institutions won't really fulfill or enact the right to health if they don't try to make them do it. And I think the student movement is now, you're seeing popular mobilization in a way that I think could be really heartening for reforms in the education sector. So I don't disagree with your critique. I worry about it too. And I'm sure, you know, there are many egregious cases of actors, I think, abusing the Ministério Público for, yeah, but I'm not sure that it always, in any uniform or homogeneous way, works to depoliticize and criminalize politics always and everywhere. I think particularly, you know, in Brazil, I mean, I think a lot of these questions, they break down on sectors and depend on activists around particular causes. And I think that's part of what Eric was pointing to when he mentioned the paper before about, well, even if you want to talk about labor, well, it's a splintered coalition in many countries. Political elites are splintered. And so I think that's part of what's so vexing and troubling, and at the same time it can be hopeful about some of these new democratic spaces, is that, yeah, I think it depends on all politics is local on some level, and look at the cases I know, the Ministério Público being wielded for some pretty well, in the eyes of the health activists, pretty laudable purposes. I'm not sure completely nullified by the other more, you know, egregious cases of them being wielded to try to criminalize politics. And I don't know, if you had to break it down, what's more frequent and what's that the Ministerial Público is being used for more often. But I'd welcome hearing more about the cases that you're the most worried about.
Yeah, I was referring mainly to the car wash operation.
Yeah.
Mainly to this group that is composed by the Ministério Público, the judiciary, and the federal police. Because they should control each other, but they are actually working with each other. So the judiciary, instead of judging, they are accusing too. You know, that's what worries me. So they are not held accountable.
Well,
They should hold each other accountable. That's
Okay.
That sounds to me like a case of him
Great.
usurping powers of the Ministerial Público.
Okay, I do want multiple conversations as well. Eric, do you want to address briefly Salvador, the military, and the issues of, I don't know, security?
The problem, you know, well, I'm reminded, David Snowden, whose name came up earlier, that Alejandra mentioned, has a book proposal, I don't know how far along it is beyond proposal, looking at how left governments can or can't deal with serious security, citizen security challenges, and the broader questions of policing. And the chapter that I saw, or the prospectus that I saw, had some very interesting hypotheses about why this is so complicated for the Latin American left, and I think we're very provocative. To me, the Salvadoran case is so far out of the control at this point of the domestic left. The demands that the FMLN government is facing from not only its constituencies, but the population more generally, the pressure that it's getting from outside actors, the stresses on the economy and on the social fabric of an accumulation of years of deportations of criminals who have no way to reintegrate in Salvador, which, by the way, may grow a much greater problem in the Northern Triangle now. I mean, governments are absolutely mortified about what happens if there are either further mass deportations or of people who have issues with the law, or people who don't have issues with the law. I mean, there's what, 250,000 Salvadorans who have been workers in the United States under temporary protected status since the 2001 earthquake. That gets renewed every 18 months. Every one of those working class Salvadorans shows that they've been working, pays $500 to the Department of Homeland Security, and gets renewed for another 18 to 24 months. Well, are they going to get renewed now? And if not, what is going to happen to those working class families in the United States who they get sent back to Salvador to renew what, right? So all of these are things that no FMLN or other government has a particularly easy time dealing with. It's also the case that they were pressured by the State Department and the embassy to cut favorites deals with the Americans' old clients in the military left over from the war, right? And so they never had a free hand to really run the security policy that they had to do. To link it in a way to Alejandra's point and to John's, I mean, I think Alejandro is right on in the slippages in the argument that I was making. I think one has to go back and ask, why was it that social democratic coalitions were possible in European capitalism, right? And I think there's a couple of things. One of which is it was possible, largely based on an industrial working class, but not exclusively. It was possible to stitch together majorities or near majorities that in circumstances of competitive politics could create pressure for redistributive change. And at the same time, it was possible either through conviction or I think more in terms of through fear to compel elites to cede in exchange for certain guarantees, right? And so I think to transfer that to the Latin American context, it means constructing majority coalitions comprised of different social forces. This gets to John's question. And I think the left turns are interesting because in a whole bunch of places they did that, right? But at the same time, channeling their demands in such a way as to compel elites to surrender some bits of their privilege. And the most interesting book that I've read recently that I think gives us some hints about how to think about that is Tasha Fairfield's 2015 Cambridge book on, I'm getting the title wrong, it's not elites and tax regimes, but that's basically what it is. And the question is, when were the cases when Latin American governments, since Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and there's I think one more, were able to compel elites to finance the state in ways that permitted redistribution? And a big part of it was not just that there was a coalition in support of governments, it was also that the elites feared. They feared the results of their refusing to contribute to the public good. They feared the state. I think I want to think that through a little bit further to start answering the questions that you all have. And I mean, in the Salvadoran case, this was the thing that Tunis's people had the idea, it wasn't shared completely. The Frente had a much more confrontational notion left over from the war and left over from the Leninist way of thinking in politics, right? But the people who were really guiding Tunis's administration had the idea of identifying sectors of the elite, of the business elite, that were prepared to coexist with the rest of Salvadoran society in a competitive system in which there would be some degrees of social protections for all citizens, and recognize that they would need to pay for that, in exchange for which they would have a lot of their particular interests represented. And what happened? What happened was they said, oh yeah, but when a significant issue that affected their interests would come before the Economic and Social Council that they had agreed to sit on, they would only discuss it on the condition that neither labor nor the social movements nor any of their interlocutors would be allowed in the room, right? And that's where I was going with the bit about they just never accepted the need to recognize that they were equals in their plural society.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, on the one hand, I completely agree with what's come up the last few minutes about, how do you get elites to give up a little bit of power? You need something to pressure them with. You need that to be a little bit afraid. And yet, the other thing that I've been thinking about here today is sort of discourse and ideas and visions. And I can't quite tie together, but two thoughts. I was struck, it's quite true that there are higher moral expectations from the left, and that's probably right. I mean, the left says we are, our rationale isn't just growth, it's justice, it's redistribution. And occasionally you get a Nelson Mandela and a Gandhi, and the rest of the time you have to deal with the real world. So I think it's true that somehow, at some point, a culture that recognizes democracy is, the worst political system except for the others, and nobody's perfect, and everybody makes mistakes, and even Lula, who's a pretty good guy and who's done incredible things, has cut some corners to get some things done. I don't know where you come to that culture, but I think it's somehow important. And then that's somehow connected with my other observation that I can't quite put together. And this piggybacks on what you said, Alejandra, about media. Okay. Be careful what you do. Because sure, if you look again, I'll use the Israel case, the big, global focus on Paul, etc. Yeah, sure, there's bias, there's bias, but watch, it could be worse. Because again, now I'm thinking of my country, the US, it's worse. We're down to creepiness. There's no fact base at all. People get their news, so many people get their news from sound bites and internet searches that yes, yeah, and for 2 years, this whole thing, people still believe that Obama was born in Africa, and Trump could just throw out a comment about, oh, well, even if Hillary won the popular vote, she didn't really because of all the millions. That was a fact. Large numbers of people believe it's a fact. So I don't know where to go with that, but that's what disturbs me about the media. The people who get their news from Steve Bannon types on Congress.
Gerardo.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about what we're talking about and how all the different perceptions that have conspired as to what it is that we're study. And I mean, the way that we constructed the paper was taking people public, projecting also from the previous saying, what they take it. But there seem to be two kinds of extremes here in terms of discourse. I mean, one would be John, where it reminded me of a comment made by Borges 2 decades ago. Where he said, the last major event that happened was when Christopher Columbus arrived at this hemisphere. So, I mean, that's what he counted as an event. Everything else is totally irrelevant, right? But with the topic that we have at hand, we figured we have enough data and information to assess what's been going on in the terms of the debate. And so we actually deductively extracted, the 13 variables that were measurable or have been measured. So that's what we did. Now, I guess the other extreme has been brought up by Alejandra and seconded by John, the parents, that is. Where are the people? Well, to me, people are everywhere. And the social movements were declining the rights of the land and so on and so forth. But so the point is, there's very different levels of that. And I guess what we've been talking about in a way is, what have been the different strategies of transformation? And the strategy of transformation that has been relevant in Latin America since 1999 has been one of 3 major strategies. And one has been the Leninist, the confrontational, direct takeover of the state. That pretty much failed with some of the repeated guerrillas and so on and so forth. And I guess it's a lot of the sort of exception so that the FMLN, which has become, has been powered through reforms, I guess the fact that they are so ruthless and now empowered is no surprise to me because they come from a military culture. And I think that's one of the reasons why the other strategy for transformation, the other thing, the anarchist strategy of transformation, which we prefer not to deal with the state. But then what we've been dealing with, as far as I can understand in this particular proposal, is the intermediary strategy for social transformation, which is the social democratic type of transformation, which is an interaction of social movements and the state. So the state is taken seriously as a terrain for advancing the conditions in which we can achieve human flourishing. And some of our variables like increasing minimum wages, tax revenues to be used for instance, social spending, proportion of seats held by women in national parliaments, and so on and so forth. These are all concrete things, where concrete people participate. So, I guess my point is that we need to agree on what's the level of analysis that, where we could have a conversation.
John wanted to interject.
but it doesn't really follow on from what Gerardo was saying. So
Interject
others
in.
would like to. No, I was wanting to come back on, that boring old matter of boring social democratic politics. And I just want, Eric, earlier emphasizing how significant it will be as to whether basically Latin American capital succeeds in diversifying. And what you meant by that was moving into sort of knowledge-based sectors of the economy. I don't know. I'm just wondering what the implications of that could be in relation to capital giving a bit, because I think that in the history of the development of social democracy in Scandinavia, part of the coming together, the pact, was that capital needed that labor on its side. And so I'm just sort of wondering whether you see, whether you see developments of that you refer to as diversification taking place, and then what the implications of that might be in relation to the possibilities of a pact. And of course, a further part of the Scandinavian deal was, I don't really understand the economics of it, but I know a Norwegian economist who's written extensively about wage compression. That was an important part of that.
This is critical, that if you get an economy that is following, say, a Scandinavian knowledge-intensive mode, you have to have a dynamic workforce. You have to have a workforce that has substantial skills and is itself capturing a significant portion of the rents. There was a very interesting book that Cecilia Montero, I think her name was, published in '99, but very little attention outside of Chile, called La Revolución Empresarial Chilena, right? The entrepreneurial revolution in Chile. And she shows in great detail how Chilean capitalism became much more flexible, became hungry for new markets, showed some degree of Schumpeterian animal spirits and blah, 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 blah. And at the very end of the book, she says, but at the end of the day, it's going to reach a ceiling. It will not cross the second industrial divide of Peoria and Sable and move fully into a post-war accumulation. Why? Because it will never agree to share power with the subaltern. That the Chilean elite cannot bring itself to cross that. Now, I think one of the questions for evaluating what may have taken place with the left turns is, to what extent are the subaltern, have they erupted onto the scene, into the public and the arena in ways that they never can be pulled back, that they have to be accepted as equal citizens. The logical ramification of that would be eventually they become partners in the construction of an economic project.
Max.
Take up this with the Steve, this is exactly something I really discussed at Yale. And there were different arguments that there are very, very few examples of social democracy in the Latin American context. When we think of it, there were a lot. It was one of the very small. And I think part of the problem is precisely this question that it's not the kind of case that you would make in so it's not that capital has an interest in the expansion of prosperous classes. I think that the case of what Steve described kind of argument of compromise is capitalism tends to produce inequality, and that tends to be destabilizing. So you need reforms to ensure the viability on those viability of capitalism, and something that certainly saves capitalism from itself, or sort of reform if you feel that in the Latin American context, the case for reform is a different kind of case. It has to be something more along the lines of And I think you can make a very strong argument that countries that invest in their own people can see that investments in social capital providing people with the capabilities to be agents, both economic and social, tends to produce outcomes in which at least have a broad options. They're not only you know, growth through reducing costs, growth through cheap labor. That actually the population, you know, the sort of things that we're talking about productive diversification of the economy become possible where you have enough of a foundation for education, training, and so forth, where you can begin to pursue a lot of strategies with that. And I think one reason that really troubles me is that you know, one of the reasons for not pursuing that is the availability of professional guidance. And I think nothing I think can be more devastating to that strategy, both because violence has long-lasting traumatic effects on people's capacity to be citizens and agents and productive, but also because it closes off a whole range of policy. It provides for an alternative to possibility. So that's why I think that one of the things that we should not be losing sight of in this conversation is the incredibly important limiting conditions on
But isn't the saying that
well, see, I think there's a sort of subtle come together because this is a really cold one, and actually it has a lot to do with that. One of the arguments in that original piece was the left that experienced repression in the 1970s became the response to the good left, because they recognized the importance of affirming human rights. So there's a kind of human rights culture in Argentina and worldwide, and Brazil, and so forth, that if you don't necessarily see the number of radicals, you certainly don't see it in many countries. You sure don't see it. I haven't seen, you know, thousands of people killed in Mexico since Calderon declared the war on drugs. Look at the level of violence in Colombia, level of violence in Peru. You know, I think that's those are the cases where I'm concerned about. And if I could say, just turns out one thing, because the study isn't about relatively testing. If you think about, you know, we've talked about the but actually, you know, there's been success there. Here's a country that has been incredibly successful at a host of reforms involved in you know, not only perhaps what some of them need to like initiatives and promote economy, substantial efforts of redistribution, substantial efforts that include and participation, process of constitutional change. But this grade, the grades that are decisive, the business stuff kind of got on board, they pursued the kind of state, you know, the kind of macroeconomic policies, or avoided the worst extremes of kind of macroeconomic populism that Eric was talking about. And this is one of the countries where, you know, I would argue the legacies of colonialism and race are massive indigenous populations kind of back to this economy. So why is that the case? Again, I think one of the big questions is, again, there's very massive violence with the exception of talk about with the existing context and actually very powerful source of mobilization for the national community. So in fact, the argument about, you know, the countries where all the structural conditions line up against democratization and inclusive capitalist development, that it actually is possible where levels of violence are going.
I fear this is going to be the last word because we've got like 60 seconds, but I'm sort of bursting with it. So, but there's another argument, right? There's another argument which I'm not sure if it gels also with what Alejandra was saying, which is that okay, first of all, well, this is my argument earlier or elsewhere, right? that actually the left terms came in to try and provide at least a fiction of the social pact that was no longer viable, right? But I think Venezuela is a key example of that. And maybe now that the elites no longer care about that, and that I think that's partly because of the privatization of security, right? You no longer need the military when you've got your gated communities and security guards and so on and so forth, right? There's abandonment of the national community and abandonment of the street to some extent because it's literally the gating off of the street. And that goes back to Alejandra's question at the beginning, why are we so obsessed with the national when the right no longer is, right? Or the elite, right? It no longer is because it's fully globalized, right? There's something nostalgic in our talking about national cases when this new right is no longer that. I mean, it's a different kind of elite, and in that sense, it's not the Creole elite. It is the hop a flight to Miami, capital flights, so on and so forth, elite. That's another depressing way to end things, I suppose. But okay,
what an optimistic note.
Keep hope alive somehow. We have Chris to thank for that. We have everyone to thank for so much. I think this has been a really productive, quite intense day. I'm going to put there is alcohol available. I'm going to put the address up. Although I think we didn't mention that. I think the time is 8 o'clock, right?
No.
Oh no,
Just
come now.
Come.
Okay, so
Hungry, we need drinks.
well, thank you to everyone. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, good job. Very good.